Hi, I'm Tsedal Neeley. I'm on the faculty of the Harvard Business School and author of Remote Work Revolution.
And I'm Tarun Khanna. I'm privileged to also be faculty at Harvard Business School with my colleague and friend Tsedal, professor interested in entrepreneurship in developing countries.
So, Tarun, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I'm just so thrilled that we'll have an opportunity to talk about some topics that we're both very passionate about.
Of course.
Global work, global work, remote work, and creating opportunities for emerging leaders. And before we delve into those, I'm actually very curious. What's it like to be you nowadays? How are you?
Oh my goodness, at all. How am I? I'm well. I think in the scheme of things, we're lucky. We have it relatively easy. A lot of people are going through a lot of difficulty this year, as you know, with the pandemic. I think we're really privileged to be able to use our platform to think of good research, good intellectual capital, good ways to accumulate things to teach people, and to include those who are less fortunate in our thoughts and our work in some ways. And that's really the driving passion of pretty much everything that I do. Um, and it's tough at some level being marooned for someone like me who has lived the last 25 years of my life on a plane, going to different developing countries, and now being in one place. I think literally today is 1 year since the pandemic was officially declared. So who would have thunk it?
Who? Who? I mean, a full year, and we're not
Something.
quite out of it yet. We're not quite out of it yet. You're right. We're very privileged. We're very blessed in that we can continue our work, even though we can't travel the way that we did. I probably didn't travel quite as much as you did, but I used to travel so much. So what's the remote life transition been like for you in terms of doing the work that you do from a distance? What's that been like for you?
And we'll talk a lot about this. I think this. I always had this driving idea, and I still do. And that's part of the philosophy, as you know, of the Harvard Business School also, is that immersion in the phenomenon allows you to understand it most deeply. And Sadal, by training, I'm a mathematician and masquerading as an economist, masquerading as a business school professor. And so for me, it's all about, iteration between abstraction, thinking of some abstract model, but then really kind of mixing it up with the folks who are in the middle of the phenomenon and living their lives with them to some extent. And that really takes physicality, right? And presence and immersion. Um, and that's been missing. So on the one hand, I sometimes tell my wife that I think I'm living on fumes.
Oh,
In other words, I had all this, stimulus from the past, whatever, 5, 10 years, and I'm sitting in my lovely backyard and writing and thinking and video conferencing, and I'm exploiting all that latent knowledge that's been sitting in my head. But at some point, it's going to run out, and I need to get out there again and replenish the insight. So that's kind of what goes through my mind when I think about that. But how about you?
that's amazing. It's interesting because I have so fully embraced remote work in terms of, my setup right now, if you saw it, it's you would think that it's kind of a little television station, because I said to myself that if this is going to be our reality, and knowing so much, I've been studying global work, virtual work, remote work for
Right, for a
almost
long
20
time.
years, for almost 20 years.
Yeah.
So I just immersed myself in that for the first time, and to
See, but
see,
that's exactly what I was talking about, right?
yeah,
That you're living, in your case, the phenomenon is the remoteness.
yes,
You're actually living it. You're living the immersion right now.
yes,
For some of us, the remoteness is not the phenomenon that we're studying. We're studying, like in my case, trying to figure out how do I get. I always say, just to make a point, 6.5 out of the 8 billion people in the world who are not lucky. Think about that, 6.5 out of 8 billion people who are not lucky, to somehow, I don't know, I think of ladders, metaphorical ladders into modernity, and somehow get them so that they can, first of all, see the ladder and then put their first foot on the first rung, and then they're on their own. But at least if we can get them to that point, my goodness, wouldn't that be nice?
Be
But that's the
amazing.
phenomenon. Yeah.
That's amazing. So can I ask you to talk about one of your incredible initiatives that I'm so excited about? In the US, in the last year, we've seen yet another racial reckoning with the string of
Oh,
killings.
it's so dispiriting and harsh.
Really is. It really is. And George Floyd is a name that now has become a household name because we actually witnessed his, some people call it lynching, his killing. And many people want to do something to contribute to the communities. And you are taking your crossroads initiatives and looking to do work with African Americans and Latinx. Tell us about Crossroads and what you're hoping to achieve.
Yes, thank you, Tsedal. I mean, it's a project that started right here with our good friend Kareem Lakhani, who is
Uh,
also like us, a pointy-headed professor.
and we
But
love Korea.
he
Yeah.
does have a practical bone in his body somewhere. And so, both of us grew up in the developing world. We were born in the developing world, and just thought it would be nice to be able to use, and in a sense, we both think algorithmically, right? Given our training.
You
And so our
do.
thought was, can we somehow just use computing power, these little computers we all carry on our phones, right? Use that algorithms to try to administer tests at scale to millions of people who are first in family to college in different countries, as a proxy for what disadvantage might look like, imperfect proxy.
You said first and family.
First in
What,
family
what,
to
what
college.
does that mean? What does that mean?
So what that means is if you're the very first person in your extended family to have had the chance to go to any college, it likely means that obviously by definition, your parents, your grandparents had not been to college, and very likely you're not in as good material shape as people who did have the opportunity to do it. So it's a proxy for likely disadvantaged background in some
Mm,
ways. Um, and so we began this in 8 countries in the Indian Ocean Rim because we were doing other work in that part of the world, in the Middle East, East Africa, the Indian subcontinent. Um, and it exploded, Siddharth. I mean, people found out about it. It was all free. We were just doing it ourselves with some alumni help. We identified people, we flew them to Dubai. So think about, a young lady from Bangladesh somewhere who had never left her village, and her father had to sell the family cow so that they could buy a bus ticket to get to a place where they could get on a plane that we would pay for and get them to Dubai, where
wow.
we would organize this extravaganza. So I'm just using that as a way to illustrate. Or a Ugandan refugee who had migrated to Accra in West Africa, and from there came to our program and managed to get her foot on the ladder that I was talking about earlier, and is now in the Netherlands,
Wow.
living a professional life from a refugee camp to a professional life. So that's what we're trying to orchestrate. And over 3 years, it mushroomed into 115 countries very quickly. And last year, there was a wonderful gentleman here in the Harvard system who used to run Morehouse College, John Wilson. And he caught hold of me and said, let's do something for the African American community. He's, of course, African American himself, and Morehouse is one of the
Yes.
storied HBCUs in this country, historically Black colleges and universities. And we were thrilled to do it. We were just thrilled. So we made a small start, and this year we're partnering with the UNCF, the United Negro College Fund, which is
Mhm.
an umbrella body that
Yes.
reaches out to large numbers of minority communities, primarily but not exclusively African American. And, it's a long run partnership. So we're really put out the word and we're getting streams of applications coming in. And we're just so thrilled to be able to do a small thing and be able to find talented kids who might otherwise not be noticed by the mainstream and say that, hey, this kid is as good as a Harvard kid. He or she deserves a chance. By the way, Tsedal, I'm so proud that about half our kids are women. So
Oh,
I'm really, really proud of that.
oh,
So,
that's wonderful.
and to be honest, we didn't do anything. We just put out the algorithms, and the natural number was half. So
Listen,
nice.
this if algorithms and technology does that,
But this time it did. Yeah,
this
time it
time
did.
this time it did. So just one more question about this before, because I want you to talk about the training too. I mean, you talked about
Yeah.
program. Love to hear just a tad about that. So
Yeah.
this next round is coming up. Then when is it coming up? And if there are folks who
Yeah,
want to
so we,
apply and
no,
join,
so
where do they go?
it's still not too late. We will put up in this interaction some kind of slide that illustrates where to go. There's a website where you can apply. The initial part of the application probably doesn't take more than an hour. The application is a multi-stage process. So the last date for the application is March 22nd. So on the one hand, it's coming up, but remember, it just takes an hour. And
Just
it
takes
really
an hour.
takes a suspension of disbelief. That's what it takes. Because people would look at it, particularly from the disadvantaged backgrounds, and say, like in Africa, it was very common to hear, this is fake. There's so many scams floating around. And going to the theme, Tsedal, that you and I should talk about, trust. Right? There was
Trust.
so much mistrust about the idea that somebody would come and give you something for free that people didn't believe it. So we had to mobilize grassroots movements in so many different African countries and South Asian countries to get people to apply. But the application is just an hour to get started, and then we step the applicants through a multi-stage process. And along each stage, we're very careful that there is some learning that occurs. That there's an assessment, you get some feedback, you take a short course that's free. Everything is free. You take a short course, you learn some more. And as you progress, right, you get benchmarked with other people, young leaders like you, young would-be leaders like you from around the world. And then just imagine, again, somebody from Uzbekistan, somebody from Bolivia is suddenly saying, hey, I'm just like that other kid from Zimbabwe, right? There's nothing different.
Powerful.
How nice
Powerful.
is that? How nice is
Powerful. It's amazing. You talked about a ladder that helps people, but you're also giving them such exposure to the world. You'll have to let me teach in this program one
Oh,
day.
you've got to teach now. Yeah.
I would be all in. I'd be excited to
And
join.
and your work on remote work is so important to this. I'm so glad that there's a book now. Of course, I'm familiar with all the
Yes.
writings and so on. I'm so glad
Yes.
that there's a book that we can draw on, because in a sense, we've pulled together willy-nilly this um, coalition of the willing from all over the world, right? So many people. I mean, there must be 300 more fortunate people like us who are volunteering their time. By the way, this is entirely a labor of love. There is
Yes.
not a single
Oh,
person who's paid for anything. It's all our donation of time, money, foundations, corporations stepping up
incredible.
and saying, we'd like to do it, we'd like to do
It's
it. I'd love to
incredible.
be able to preserve that.
It's incredible. It's the kind of thing that I talk about statistical changes in people's families. You're literally changing the trajectory of an entire family if you give people just the opportunity to learn and give people exposure.
So let me tell you about one conversation in my office with Kareem, my partner in crime, right? So we were sitting here wondering, that's nice. Even if this succeeds and we find smart kids who are otherwise disadvantaged and we bring them to Dubai, what are we going to do? It's not like we have endless money ourselves. We'll do something with them for 7 days, 10 days. We'll introduce them to people, and then we'll have to drop them like hot potatoes because we don't have the resources. I'm so glad we tried because, it's cliched. Um, it changed their lives. And I think the reason I'm hypothesizing, we're social scientists, we always have hypotheses and we test them. So my current hypothesis is that, listen, you are validating someone's existence, first of all, as an impartial third party. That is huge. To be able, how many times, even now, I mean, I'm an established person, I'm lucky. Even now, if one of my colleagues says, oh, that was so nice, I feel, wow, somebody appreciated me, right? And so imagine if nobody's ever appreciated you and suddenly you're told, hey, you're as good as the best. Wow, it changes your life. And then there's this aspiration that opens up to you. And you begin to imagine the unimaginable. And that's what it is. And so they are so motivated that even though we dumped them at the end of our Dubai extravaganza, they just ran with it. They self-organized, they created communities, they helped each other, they traveled across borders, they got internships with people that they knew of from our introductions. And that's without us doing anything.
Listen, I've always believed that sometimes what people need is literally a hand to reach out and say, come this way.
That's
And
what it
then
is.
they'll take it. They'll take it and they'll run with it. And I'm truly hoping that your continued efforts and your partnership with HBCUs and looking at Black and brown populations in the US, you'll be able to just nudge and pull and unleash people's talents and potentials.
From your lips to the ears of God.
From my lips, hey, I'll take that. And I also truly believe that we're in the era of scale. Yes. Remote work, technology allows us to scale and reach people in ways that we just could not easily. And so I think the moment is here and now. One of the concepts that you have developed that I love, deeply related to this topic and even the topic of remote work is contextual intelligence. Contextual intelligence, you talk about we need to drop our assumptions and learn the context in which we are engaging. But yet there's always a question for me. How do you know what you don't know? A huge problem in remote work. I was hoping you would talk about this.
Yeah, it's a huge sort of problem in philosophy, actually, that goes through the ages, right? And so I try to think of a working person's definition of what I meant, because contextual intelligence sounds like a mouthful. But really what it's saying is that you should have of course, the smarts, but the humility to know the limits of what you know. Right? What are the limits of applicability of the knowledge that you've been privileged to build up in your own study, in your own experiences, so that you know where you use it productively and don't do any harm in some ways. And I often ask, we're fortunate enough to be teaching at Harvard some of the most talented people around. And I'm amazed at how much each of us, myself included, overestimates the applicability of our past experiences. And there are people, far more eminent than I, who have written about these biases coming out of psychology. And one of the biases, I think, and I'm just translating it into a different form to make it more accessible to my populations. The idea, particularly in doing work in developing countries, particularly coming from a Western society, which is not where I was born or grew up, and trying to say, I remember sitting in the MBA classroom as a student at HBS, and my family had businesses in India, and I remember thinking, these HBS professors are great, but they don't know what they're talking about, because none of this is going to work in New Delhi, right? It's not going to work. And I remember thinking, there's nothing wrong with the logic of what's being presented. The logic is impeccable. It's just the application of that logic, in Boston is so different from Bogota or Bujumbura or Bombay. or pick your city, right?
Indiana, Chicago,
Yeah, yeah,
LA,
absolutely.
Florida,
You're
Texas.
absolutely right. Yeah, and you're bringing me closer to home because my normal beat is not the
Yeah,
Midwest, but you're absolutely right. I mean,
yeah,
when we think about the limits of applicability, even now when I travel, I love to travel. So I've been all over I don't know, maybe 40 out of the 50 states and hiked and camped and so on and so forth. But you're absolutely right. You feel the texture of the place is different in different places. And it's humbling to recognize that. And that's what I'm trying to get at with this idea of contextual intelligence. And actually it connects to the work that you've done on trust,
yes,
right? Which is how do you
yes.
establish trust with an unfamiliar other? Why don't you tell us about that?
How do you establish trust with people you barely see, whose context, environments, homes you don't know, you may never even know, which is a classic problem when it comes to virtual work and you're crossing national borders. And it's interesting because trust is one of the most studied topics in the
That's exciting.
virtuality area for obvious reasons, right? How do you work with people you don't trust, you don't feel confidence? So the first thing is, what is trust? Trust is defined as having confidence in the actions that others have in terms of they're dependable, they're reliable, and we feel safe around them. So their actions instills confidence in us. That's the basic social scientist definition of trust. Now, when we go into a remote environment, social scientists had actually developed different ways of thinking about trust. There are two types of trust. One is called cognitive trust, meaning the trust that is gained by observing people's dependability and reliability. And you can get that very quickly. In fact, in remote work, people talk about swift cognitive trust, meaning I see Tarun, I know he's dependable, I know he's reliable. I am confident that collaborating with him, despite the fact that we're not in the same place, is going to work. The second type of trust, which is harder to get, very important, particularly for managers, is called emotional trust. Emotional trust is having the belief grounded in others' care and concern for us. Takes much longer to develop, harder to maintain, but you kind of need both types of trust, even though the cognitive one is sufficient to do work.
That's so useful. But Tsedal, tell me, is it possible to think of starting with cognitive trust and building your way to emotional trust? Does that make sense to think
Absolutely.
about it?
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked that because you start with cognitive trust, and the way you build emotional trust, you know how you build it in two ways. One is developing empathy for others and others' experience of working with you. We call that reflected knowledge. So being able to put yourself in the shoes of others, which is why I love contextual intelligence, because that's what it
Yeah,
really
that's the same
is.
thing. Yeah,
That's what
yeah,
it really is, to
yeah.
put yourself in the shoes of others. And the second thing is, believe it or not easy for everyone, self-disclosure. In other words, is sharing of yourself.
Yes, yes.
There are many studies that have found, and this has been practiced by so many people, that if I disclose of myself personal things, not crazy things,
Right, right.
there's such a thing as too much information, but the more I share of myself, my preferences, my concerns, my aspirations, the more you find me approachable, likable, and trustworthy.
I can so relate to that. I mean, my kids always joke that you wear your heart on your sleeve, and
Yeah,
it,
oh,
it's so true. I emphasize with that. I mean, I go, and partly it's a reminder to myself that I guess it's the way my mom brought me up, right? It's like you're so fortunate, better do something that leaves the world a better place than the way
that
you
you know.
found it. And constantly reminding myself, what am I doing? It's nice that I have all these amazing colleagues and students, but by and large, we're all pretty privileged. And so let's not forget, you know, our other fellow travelers. And
I
I
love
always
your
start with
mom.
that,
I love
right?
your mom.
Oh, my
She,
mom is the source of my strength.
oh, that, first of all,
Moms
that's
are the
my,
most important. Yeah.
listen, I feel the same way about my mom.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny. My mother is mild mannered, kind of this calm person, but so wise and
Strong. Yes.
strong. But like your mother, she gave you these values that you're still walking with. This idea of contributing to the world.
I hope so. I mean, we all have to try. So, in whatever small way we can. But these ideas are so,
Yeah.
so related. On the idea of trust, and I love the distinction between cognitive and emotional trust. And as I reflect on my own writings on trust, which are fairly limited, I wrote a book on trust as a
I was going to say,
foundation.
you wrote a whole book on trust.
Yes, but it's not that much, honestly. It's a book that's my personal experiences on building enterprises in developing countries. So, Tsedal, my other hat is I'm an entrepreneur. I build a lot of companies and nonprofits that are all catering to the mass market and are always in developing countries. And so the book I wrote on trust, creating the foundation for entrepreneurship in developing countries, is in your language all about developing cognitive trust as a first step. Because if you think about cognitive trust, it's really enormously helped by something pretty, important but pedestrian, like adequate data that are credible and reliable, right? And in most parts of the developing world, in Africa, South Asia, Latin America, it's very hard to get credible data. I mean, we talk a lot about big data, but it's garbage in and garbage out.
Yeah.
So unless you have really good data that you can work with, so I had this pithy phrase that I was using to communicate to people, which is if you want to be an entrepreneur in the developing world, right? And many of the kids who are coming to Crossroads aspire to be doing their own thing. And in a sense, that's the etymology of the French word entrepreneur, right? It's to do your own thing in some ways. But I always tell people that it's unfortunately in the developing world that is infrastructure compromised, right? It's not sufficient to say that you want to create. You have to first create the conditions to create, right? You've got to actually be cognizant that there are so many infrastructure limitations around you, including, credible information, reliability, sanctity of promises, and so on, that you have to somehow create the supporting mechanisms before you can actually embark on your entrepreneurial journey. And in a sense, it makes it harder, but that's a fact of life. It's better to call a spade rather than attempt something unrealistic. So that's the way I think about
Oh,
developing cognitive trust.
so how do you do that? I mean, in what you just said, I got a slightly overwhelmed because what you said is the system is not built in a way, structured in a way where there are the checks and balances and evidence that you need
Yeah.
to trust institutions. So how do you gain this trust? How do you build the trust before you embark on your endeavors?
So it's, unsurprisingly, Tsedal, it's stuff that your mom and my mom taught you and me. It's not more complicated. It's not easy to do, but it's not complicated to say. I'll give you an example. Um, uh, I was on the board of India's biggest microfinance company. We made small loans to poor women. It was a company that was publicly traded, very successful, very profitable, and serving millions of women, poor women, and recouping loans with the lowest interest rates in the world for that kind of firm. Right? Somebody took it upon themselves to say that they weren't happy with this and kind of went after the company and the entire sector, precipitating a political and a financial crisis for the entire sector. So, given that backdrop, right? So we somebody else's actions caused society to lose trust in us.
Mm.
And so the question was, what do you do as a member of the leadership team? And I write about this in my book on trust. And I think ultimately the thing that got us through it stronger than before at the end of it, after 3-4 years of trial by fire, right, was essentially walking the talk. None of the senior management left, none of the board left. We all took the hits. We all avoided hitting back and doing low blows the way we were being hit. Um, and we were just very patient, walking the talk and taking the pain along with every rank and file member of the community. And people just saw it over time. And I guess in your language, you would say that they built emotional trust with us, right? But we had to create those conditions to be able to build the company back in some ways.
That's exactly it.
So another summary way to say it is that trust is an asset, right? And we teach about assets and liabilities in our classroom at HBS.
Yeah.
And like any asset, if you want to build an asset, invest in an asset, it takes time. And if you want to credibly commit to doing something, it takes time and money, right? I think of trust, of cognitive trust, the same way. It's an investment, and it's going to take time, and it's going to take resources over time.
Yes, and you have to understand it as an asset that you cannot do without.
That's right.
There's no way. Yeah, it's so necessary. There's no way I could have written a book about remote work, nor all the work that I've done over the last, I don't know how many, almost 20 years, without having trust at the center of it, because it's foundational. It's foundational in this kind of environment. I want to ask you, as we go to conclude, I'm learning so much about you, Tarun. This is like amazing.
Likewise.
I'm like, how can one...
And your office is right next to mine.
That just makes no sense. See, remote work works. If it wasn't for remote work, we wouldn't be doing this right now.
You were always the wiser one. So.
I don't know about that. But when I was looking to get my PhD in order to go into academia, I actually looked, and this was 2001, 2002. I looked for programs where I could study virtual work, global work.
Wow.
Because I said technology is changing the world. I could not imagine a world where we can think of teams to be co-located, domestic, or that are not dispersed. I just could not imagine a future without that, because I love technology. And
can I tell you about our Crossroads team right now? We have 3 people in Cambridge, Mass, right here. We have 1 in San Francisco. We have 1 in Bali, Indonesia. We have 2 in Dubai. We have 1 in Nairobi. And we have 1 in Tokyo. That's our core team of volunteers who are collectively making this happen. So there you go.
That's amazing.
It's your remote team.
I'll be like the young people. That's like, I love. That's a heart. Love that. But that's the only way. You needed that distribution in order to serve 115 nationalities. That's the only way. You can't do it sitting in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I want to ask you, you talked about trust. As we go to close, one of the things that I am worried about, and with all the things that you do, you're also a strategy person, right?
That's right. Yes.
I'm worried about COVID, vaccines, global distribution. Trust is part of it.
Huge part.
What do you think is going to happen? What can you tell us, given all that you know about all markets, not just one, but all markets, and strategy and trust? How are we going to do this? This is the one thing that always worries me.
It's so sobering, Tsedal, just to watch the unfortunate mess that my adopted country, the United States, has put itself in with vaccines and how they politicized how we politicized vaccine dissemination. Fortunately, it's not the case in many other countries. So there's a lot to learn. I think pretty much everything that I know about vaccine distribution, I've learned from a friend on whom I recently wrote a lovely case on Gavi, which is the World Vaccine Alliance in Geneva, a gentleman named Seth Berkley. And he really is a pioneering humanitarian. He's been doing all the vaccines for Ebola, so many different diseases. That agency is a nonprofit, global nonprofit that's in charge of dissemination of vaccines for anything, any disease. And watching Seth, I go back to thinking about the creation of the right kinds of assets, right, in place, and I go back to thinking about his attempts to foster trust in the different communities, to allow vaccines from different places to be used. We have unfortunate histories of experimentation with medicines being done on minority communities in this country. And I'm sure cases of really unacceptable exploitation in other places also. So there is a lot of mistrust to overcome. But, I'm an optimist. I'm a glass half full kind of person. And I watched Seth for the last 20 years and how much he and a few well-meaning people have done to accelerate dissemination of vaccines for literally 70, 80 epidemic and potential epidemic causing diseases, and taking the long view, that I am much more optimistic. And look at Tony Fauci. Tony Fauci had this amazing article in the New Yorker like a few years ago. And I'm paraphrasing this, I may get the numbers wrong, but he basically said that 5 years ago, if you guys meaning American society, had given me $2 billion, $2 billion, I would have built a general purpose vaccine platform, which would have saved us $5 trillion, right? And so, that's water under the bridge. But going forward, I hope we all collectively take a step back and invest in the trust building assets today, so that we are less pummeled by the next pathogen that subjects us to this process called zoonosis.
Yes, and the reality is, if everyone is not safe, no one is safe. And that's that's the big thing. And I feel the same way about the work that you're doing at Crossroads. Imagine how it would be if the world got exposed to all the goodness. And it's not just me, my comfort, but also my fellow people. And that's one of the things that I love about your work. I'm just so honored that we were able to have this conversation. What a treat, Tarun. Thank you so
the privilege is all mine, Tsedal. It's so nice to get to know more about your work as well, even though you're so close. And please join us. And as I said, it's a labor of love. We're all in it together, and we'll take any help.
I would love, I'm saying this publicly, to join you at Crossroads.
Wonderful.
It would be amazing. So I'm in. Thanks,
Great.
Tarun.